Meet Brian Kloss.
My name is Brian Kloss. I'm an associate professor in global politics at University College London and a contributing writer for The Atlantic magazine. And my book is called Corruptible: Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us.
Why is it important to understand power?
Some people have asked me why I wrote this book now. Power, after all, is something that has stymied us for millennia. The ancients wrote about the problems of power. And the answer I give them is this: we have made immense progress in society in everything that we think about and how society functions, whether it's technology or advancement of solving problems. We can send rockets to distant asteroids and land with immense precision. But we still have awful leaders all around us. We have people who we do not respect who govern our lives. When I talk about this book with other people, I have never encountered somebody who has said, I don't think that book is necessary because we've basically got it right. All of our leaders are the right people, and the best of our society gets the elevator right to the top. That never happens. Everyone agrees that we have dysfunctional power in society. Why is it that despite incredible 21st century advances in every realm of medicine and science and so on, we still are stuck with all the wrong people in charge of our lives? And the answer I put forward is we don't have to be stuck with that. There's actually good evidence that points us to better solutions once we actually understand how power operates. And this book is my attempt to try to explain that power is far more complicated, but also far more fixable as a problem than we like to imagine.
How did you become interested in understanding power?
What I ended up doing is I started studying political science, and I was studying rigged elections and political violence, coups and civil wars. And so I went around the world and I did field research where I met former rebels, former heads of state in authoritarian regimes, generals, people who had been accused of war crimes. And as a result of that, I ended up in the room with a lot of really awful people who had done some really awful things. And what was striking to me was that when I came back to talk to people about this, more often than not, some of them recognized these sorts of personality traits in their bosses or in their homeowners associations. And so sort of a germ of an idea was placed in my head about, is it possible that these traits are universal in power seekers and power holders? Is there something more to the saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely? So I decided to set out and try to understand power much more than just the sort of quote-based explanations that you often get that are often trotted out in conversation, to actually understand what's happening, why we are so disappointed with our leaders so frequently, and how we might be able to fix it. And that's where the book came from.
Who is Lord Acton, and how does he relate to power?
Lord Acton is a political figure from Britain in the 1800s, and everybody knows his famous quote, which is often presented as "power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely." The backstory of it is that he was responding to a historian who was writing about the brutality of the Spanish Inquisition and was basically whitewashing it. He was basically saying that this wasn't actually as bad as people thought it was. And Lord Acton protested. He wrote a letter to this bishop and said that we need to hold people in power accountable, and we need to, if we have any sort of bias, we need to presume that powerful people are more likely to behave in corrupt ways as opposed to whitewashing their histories. And that letter is where that original quote was, where he says, "Power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely." So the start of everyone's view on power begins with that quote: "Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely." It's the most frequent thing that I hear when I talk to people about power. The real world is much more complicated than that. It is definitely true, by the way, that power does corrupt. We have plenty of evidence that it changes your psychology, it changes your neuroscience, it changes your brain. But it's only a small part of the story, and the much more interesting part of the story is how people interact with systems and why we end up with the wrong people in charge. And so what I argue in the book is that a major hidden part of this iceberg, where we just sort of see the tip, the power corrupting, the bad people doing bad things, hidden beneath the surface is a series of broken systems that attract and promote the wrong kinds of people into power. It's something that I call a self-selection effect, where people who are power hungry, which we usually use to say bad, right? They're in it for the power itself. Those people are far more likely to seek power in the first place, and very often, they're better at getting it. So we can always just blame the individual. We can always just say, this is the bad person. We can also always just blame the power and say power corrupts. But there's a hidden story that I explore in the book of how does this interact together? How do we end up designing systems that attract all of the right people into power so we get better outcomes? And that is the task, I think, for the 21st century, because it's a problem that we have not solved. Pretty much everybody you speak to is disappointed with those people who end up in charge. And so if we just say power corrupts, we can't actually solve the problem. It's much deeper than that.
What are your 4 main arguments about power?
I make 4 main arguments in my book. The first is that worse people get power. Corruptible people seek power. The second is that power makes people worse, that power corrupts. The third is that we are drawn to the wrong kinds of leaders for all the wrong reasons. And the fourth is that we can design systems to make better people end up in power, and rather than abusing that power, to use it for public service.
Why do bad people often end up in positions of power?
So one of the problems with power is that you often have people who are drawn to it like moths to a flame. And there's a mitigating factor that basically can stop some of those people from getting into power or deterring them from seeking power in the first place. But the problem is some systems of power have absolutely no barriers. And one of those is the Homeowners Association. So around 70 million Americans are members of either a homeowners association or a condominium association. It's a very close to home form of power in people's daily lives. But the problem is that there's not that much glory associated with the power of being a homeowners association president, because a lot of what you do is fine your neighbors when they put their garbage out too early, or if they haven't trimmed their trees just to your right specifications. So as a result, you're basically hoping that somebody who's community service minded will put themselves forward for that job. Instead, what very often happens is that people who actually like the idea of policing their neighbors, patrolling them, controlling them, those people are the ones who seek the power in those local community organizations the most. Because for them, the power is the goal, not the means. And as a result of that, in this small community in Arizona that I studied, there was a particularly egregious example of a homeowners association president that I call Martin McFife. I've changed his name. But Martin McFife was someone who coveted power. He wanted it for himself because he didn't want to help his community. He just liked the control. So what he did was he began to purge the homeowners association of his rivals. He then handpicked people around him to sort of be like his little junta in this little tiny Arizona community of 99 houses. And then he began establishing arcane bureaucratic rules. Specifically, you couldn't have out-of-state gravel in your garden. You had to trim the palm trees in exactly the right way to McFife's specifications. And if you didn't do this, there would be hell to pay. He would fine you if you ended up putting your trash bin out 5 minutes before it was supposed to be on the curb. As a result, some of these homeowners began to push back. They began to try to institute a recall election to destroy McFife and to unseat him from his throne of power. And he began to target them. Some of their rocks that were from these out-of-state rocks began to go missing. Occasionally, some homeowners who stood up to McFife had rocks thrown through their windows. And as a result, they produced a symbolic form of resistance, putting pink flamingos in their gardens. And this spread throughout the homeowners association so that they were cropping up across all of these yards as they tried to stand up to this tyrant at the local level. And the thing that's so crazy about this is that as McFife falls, he's unable to accept the loss of power. He drives around the neighborhood taking pictures of people who haven't trimmed their palm trees to his liking and having oleander plants that aren't supposed to be there and trying to send these really nutty newsletters around the community accusing people of being enemies of the neighborhood. Now, there's a much bigger story here than just a homeowners association. And the story is about how the systems of power can dictate who ends up in them. This is a pared back version of power. There are no checks. There's no competition. So you've just rolled the red carpet out to whoever wants to waltz in to become the president of the neighborhood association. And often those people are power hungry. When we get to higher levels of power, there is more competition. There's more scrutiny. But there are sometimes broken systems that don't do a very effective job at screening out and blocking the Martin McFifes of the world from ending up as your boss or as a politician or as even a sports coach, for example. And when those systems break down, when they haven't done their job, when we've rolled out the red carpet to the wrong kinds of people, that's when abuse of power becomes more likely. So the way that I like to think about this is that power is something that draws in the wrong kinds of people like moths to a flame. So the way you deal with that is you attract more people to basically be able to zap some of the bad moths and be left with ones who are actually in it for the right reasons. And that's why recruitment is so important. You're always going to have power-hungry people show up and try to take power. What you need to do is dilute them and block them. And that's where the system design is crucial. And I think we haven't thought carefully about that in a series of roles of power around modern life. We just sort of assume we can advertise for a position or advertise for a promotion and wait for the right people to come. It doesn't work like that. We have to actively counteract this impulse of power-hungry people to seek and abuse power. And when we design systems in an intelligent way, we can screen out and topple the Martin McFifes of this world.
Should we only give power to those who don't seek it?
When we use the word power-hungry, it's a negative insult. It means someone who's seeking power for all of the wrong reasons. They want power for the sake of power. And yet power-hungry literally means someone who wants power. Someone who wants power is going to seek power more than everybody else. As a result of that, we have a real problem on our hands. How do we stop this, right? So there's a few answers. The first is that we need to make systems of power attractive to ordinary and decent people. And that's something that doesn't happen all the time. When I was a kid, I was first sort of interested in politics because my mom ran for the local school board. She ran for the local school board because she wanted to serve her community. And that's what she did, right? She didn't actually face very many costs associated with power. She wasn't paid at all, really, but she was able to actually help people, and it didn't ruin her life. Nowadays, in modern systems of power, it's increasingly the case that going into politics or going into the highest echelons of power in business comes with a series of costs associated with them. If you survey a random assortment of 100 people and you say, would you want to be a politician? Most actually say no. They don't want power because it's so costly, it's so invasive. It's in some instances, like in Thailand, where I've done lots of field work, people who are very talented young people who have gone to elite schools will say to me, politics is where you get your life ruined. I'm gonna go into business where I keep my nose clean and don't face any scrutiny and nobody actually, checks all of my old tweets. So the problem is that we've engineered a society in which power itself is costly to everyone, and that means that the only people who think it's worth paying the cost are those who are power hungry. Because the trade-off is, yes, I accept this cost, yes, it's going to be invasive, yes, my life will be scrutinized and my family might pay a price and perhaps my family life will actually be destroyed, but I'll be powerful, so it's worth it. For everybody else amongst us, those who do not think that power is a goal in itself, they just think, it's not worth it. I don't want to do this. And I've been really worried in the last couple of years to see stories of school board members, people like my mom, who wanted to just serve their community, facing death threats, harassment, extreme costs, even at the lowest echelons of power. What does that do? It means that the next generation of people higher up in power are going to be those who covet power for the sake of power. So when you think about making power work better, you have to make it attractive to ordinary, normal, decent people. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of areas of our modern society, we've actually engineered a world in which the average person who wants to serve their community just thinks it's not worth it. Count me out.
What is self-selection bias?
Self-selection bias refers to a phenomenon in which certain kinds of people are more likely to put themselves forward for a position than other kinds of people. So a really easy way to understand this is to think about tryouts for, say, a high school basketball team, where height often confers an advantage. When you show up to that tryout, you're not going to be surprised if the people who show up are taller than average. The same is true for power. People who are power hungry, people who are psychopaths, tend to self-select into positions of power more than the rest of us. And as a result, we have this skew, this bias in positions of power, where certain types of people, often the wrong kinds of people, are more likely to put themselves forward to rule over the rest of us. And that's the start of any sort of diagnosis that can lead us to a solution, because if you don't accept, as I have argued extensively in the book, that the people who end up in power are not representative of the rest of us. They are not average and they are not normal. Once you accept that, then you can start to counteract those problems. Self-selection bias is one of the most crucial things to understanding if you want to crack the case of how to make power function better.
What is survivorship bias?
There's two forms of bias around power that are really important to understand. The first is self-selection bias, but then there's another bias called survivorship bias, and this is where we only see people who make it into power. When you think about the people you know who are powerful, those are people who have survived. They've sought power and they've obtained it and they've maintained it. The people who didn't seek power in the first place, weren't successful in achieving it, or only lasted for a short time, those don't show up when we think about powerful people. So the story of survivorship bias is derived from a great example from World War II with a statistician named Abraham Wald. Now, Abraham Wald was a statistician who was tasked by the Allied war effort with understanding how to make the Allied warplanes function better. And he was presented with a series of airplanes that had bullet holes throughout them as they had gone from bombing runs over Nazi Germany. And he looked at them and he saw that there were holes in the wings, holes in the tail, holes in the nose of the plane. And the general said to him, based on your statistical expertise, where should we put extra armor? Where should we reinforce the plane? And most of the people thought they should put them where the bullet holes were. Abraham Wald took one look at this and he said, if you put armor over the places where the holes are, you're going to make the planes get shot down more. Because the reality was, the places that didn't have bullet holes were the most crucial. The places that had been shot in the fuselage, the middle of the plane where the engine was, those were in Germany. They didn't survive. They were wrecks. So they never made it back to be analyzed. So survivorship bias is a bias where we look at the wrong kinds of data because we only look at what survived. Many of you have probably never heard of Pedro Lascaran, who's the president of Mexico for 15 minutes. And that's precisely the reason you've never heard of him, because he only was powerful for less than a quarter of an hour. Now, when we think about self-selection bias and survivorship bias in tandem, we have a really important understanding of how power actually operates. The wrong kinds of people who are power hungry seek power more in the first place. Then they're better at obtaining it. They show up in our ordinary lives because they've survived, they've made it. So when we think about who is powerful, we have to think about the people who didn't seek power in the first place. We have to think about the people who didn't obtain power in the first place. And we also have to think about the people who didn't survive in power for very long and therefore they dropped out. The presidents and prime ministers, the generals, the cult leaders, the business leaders, those people are basically people who have survived and who self-selected. And that's why both of those biases are so important for understanding how power operates.
Does evolution play a role in survivorship bias?
Survivorship bias is particularly linked to one concept of evolution, which is cultural evolution, as it's sometimes called. And this is the idea that societies can evolve. So in other words, if you think about the vast expanse of human history on the thousands of years time scale, you basically have a series of little experiments where various societies are trying out new things. And the ones that succeed, the ones that are able to flourish and procreate and win wars, are more likely to pass their genes on to the next generation. So the way that you set up a society really matters, and that is linked to power. If you set up a system of power in which you have hierarchy that functions well, you have the right kind of leaders, you produce strong armies that have very strong discipline in a hierarchical sense as well, those societies are likely to beat societies that are less effective, that have less rigorous structures of power. And so what you've seen as a major pressure on the evolution of human society is what I refer to as war and peace. Basically, a war-based explanation and an agricultural-based explanation. The war-based explanation is basically that as societies got more hierarchical and disciplined, they became more effective on the battlefield. And also, at the same time, that as agriculture took root around the same time that war became more prominent in human society, it was easier to make larger numbers of troops because you could have stable agricultural-based subsistence. As a result of the combination of both of these factors, the societies that tended to win were those that could produce armies that had lots and lots of soldiers and lots of discipline within the ranks. So there was a bias towards hierarchy. And this means that there was a cultural evolution towards more rigid hierarchical structures in human society, which differs, by the way, from how lots of societies in prehistory were set up, where there were a lot more flat structures, there was a lot more anti-hierarchy sentiment, the idea that we should all be equals, and people lived in much smaller communities, bands of often 60 to 80 people. So when you think about the long expanse of human history, you're basically looking at a form of survivorship bias in the form of cultural evolution, where the most successful societies live on, and the least successful societies get conquered and subsumed into those who have made better systems of power.
Why are we drawn to bad leaders?
One of the most uncomfortable questions to answer is, are we to blame? Why are we drawn to people who are clearly not in the business of public service, but want to abuse us and often show us that they are strong men who are oriented towards conquering and dominating rather than serving us? And that puts the mirror back on us. And the answer, I think, is partly to do with evolutionary psychology. Now, this is a field of research that's difficult to test because we can't get in a time machine and look back at how people behaved in the very distant past. But the argument goes something like this, that in times of crisis in the very distant past, it was clearly adaptive. In other words, it helped us survive to turn towards a large, physically strong man. And that's because the challenges that prehistoric societies faced, those crises, were often a threat from a warring tribe or something in which physical prowess and strength actually mattered. So they turned to those leaders. And that created a bias in our brains where we end up thinking, in times of crisis, we should have a physically large, strong man in charge of us. So when you actually look at the modern society that we inhabit, this is no longer true. Our leaders don't need to be bench pressing and becoming huge, masculine, dominant figures in order to be good leaders. We have massive numbers of examples of excellent female leaders who can't bench press as much as sort of a world-leading bodybuilder, but they're excellent leaders. So this is what's called evolutionary mismatch, the idea that our brains evolve for an environment that we no longer inhabit. Specifically, that physical strength is no longer correlated with good outcomes in leadership. And yet our brains have not adapted. And the reason they haven't adapted is because evolution takes a very long time. As we experience this environment for tens of thousands of years, where survival was linked to turning to a large man during times of crisis, a strong man, now we still have that template in our brains. It's maladaptive. It hurts us to still have this cognitive bias, and yet it still exists. And there's lots of different tests that show it exists. So for example, if you ask people to select a leader, in those times, they generally don't have as much of a strongman bias. But if you prime them, if you say, imagine that you're facing a famine, a war, some sort of catastrophe, then what people tend to do is they turn towards the physically stronger male leader at a disproportionate rate. This also tends to happen when we look at evaluations of faces or bodies in times of crisis. And indeed, during those moments where people feel threatened, the cognitive bias rears its ugly head. Now, modern leaders know this, especially in places that are prone to crises. I don't think it's much of a mistake. I think it's by design, for example, that Vladimir Putin often poses shirtless, that he tends to present himself as a strongman, and when Russia has moments where there starts to be cracks in the regime, where people start to stand up against Putin a little bit more, he often manufactures crises. He invents them in order to show that I alone can fix it, that I'm the person who can solve your problems, and here I am, by the way, shirtless on a horse. So when you see those images, it is not an accident. It is by design. He has figured out that there's a template in our brains. Maybe he hasn't read the science, but he has understood this innate aspect of human nature that we tend to turn to the wrong kinds of people in moments of crisis, and those people specifically tend to be physically large, strongman males. The term, by the way, is no accident. Strongman means strong man. And that's why dictators tend to be men. It is also why dictators tend to try to present their masculinity as something that is a credential that makes them more likely to be a good leader in a moment of crisis. So what I think is that we need to accept that some of these biases are lurking inside of our heads. We can't control them. They're the product of tens of thousands of years of evolution. They are maladaptive now. They're not good for us. But only by accepting and recognizing them can we start to counteract them. And I hope that the first step in fixing these biases is by calling them out and showing us that the data actually confirms that some of these biases do indeed exist when we select leaders.
Why do certain demographic groups often end up in power?
One of the key problems with looking at modern power is why it's so biased in terms of demographics. If you look at the Fortune 500 companies in the US or the FTSE 100 companies in the UK, these very prominent corporations, the proportion of CEOs is extremely skewed. You have over 450 men out of the 500 Fortune 500 companies. You have white men who are dominant in these positions, way more than the average would suggest. For example, 30% of the American population are white men, and 86% of the Fortune 500 CEOs are white men. So we clearly have something that's out of whack in who ends up in leadership positions in business. This is also true in politics. Only about a third of countries in the world have ever had a female leader. So why is this the case? Well, there's many, many reasons. The first reason, which we should definitely acknowledge, is just simply due to the obvious fact that modern society still has racism and misogyny rampant, particularly around leadership selection. But there's something more deep that's also happening here that's more changeable, at least in the short term. And that is that there are representation problems in high levels of power. So for example, if you are somebody who works in a company in which all of the leadership is comprised of white men, and you're a young minority woman, there is something that is sometimes referred to as the snowy peaks problem. The idea that you look up and all you see are these old white men, and they don't look like you. And you start to think, is there a place for me in this sort of group of leaders? Do I have a future in this company? And as a result, you start to see problems where people who are from minority communities or are women, they tend to bow out of extremely white male-dominated spaces. And this compounds the problem that already exists with racism and misogyny. Now, on top of that, the biases show themselves up in promotion earlier on. So when we think about why the sort of top levels of leaders are disproportionately white and male, you have to look lower down the hierarchy. And what we've seen in lots of research is that names matter a huge amount, as do faces. So let's start with names. When you randomize CVs or resumes in job applications, and you make them objectively equally qualified, you invent people, and you give them equal qualifications, and all you change is the name on the top, and then you send them off, what you find is that the evidence shows very clear bias against names that sound like they're from minorities, and also names that sound like they're from women. So if you have the exact same CV, exact same qualifications, exact same propensity to do a good job in the role, the name is actually disproportionately excluding people from job interviews. It's disproportionately disadvantaging them from promotions. This is slam dunk evidence of bias against women and minorities. It's obvious. It's randomized control trials, experiments that show proof of this. The same has been done, by the way, in academic surveys, where they look at, for example, hiring for a lab position, and they just change the name on the top. And whether a woman or a man is reading those applications, the starting salary that's proposed varies depending on whether it's a male or female name at the top of that CV. So you end up compounding biases in a series of ways. Now, one of the strangest areas of bias comes with something called baby-facedness. I'm not making this term up. It's the technical term. It's called baby-facedness. And this is the idea that every one of us has a level that you can scientifically measure of how baby-faced we are. And this has differential effects based on race. And the reason for that is because we tend to evaluate people through the prism of in-group versus out-group. It's a very simple concept to understand. It can sometimes be around race or gender, or about even more banal stuff like which football team you support. So there was one example of a study in which they studied Manchester United fans. And the study was supposed to be about something totally unrelated, a task that was quite banal, honestly. But what they asked the people who were fans of Manchester United to do was to move from one building to the next. And en route to that building, they encountered someone who's visibly injured and in need of assistance. Then they randomly assigned whether that injured person would be wearing a Manchester United jersey, no jersey, or the jersey of a rival football team. And what they found was amazing. There was a massive difference in how much they stopped to help the person depending on what jersey or what clothes they were wearing. Around 80% of the time that they were wearing the Manchester United jersey, they stopped and helped them. When they were wearing the rival team's jersey, it was about 30% of the time. So people were evaluating the value of another human's life based on in-group or out-group assessments that were tied literally to whether they supported the same sports team. Now, when this comes to race, of course, these dynamics still apply. So with babyfaceness, the problem starts to rear its ugly head in incredibly bizarre and depressing ways. One of the ways that we know that this happens is in the criminal justice system. So if you look at baby-faced defendants who are accused of the exact same crimes as someone who's less baby-faced, the baby-faced defendants are often given less harsh sentences because our innate interpretation is this person is more innocent. They look more innocent because their face seems more like a child. Now, the differential effect of baby-facedness, according to this research, is that for white men who are evaluating people to hire, they tend to view people from a different race as part of the out-group, and therefore they're more threatening. That means that baby-faced people from the out-group who are less threatening are viewed as less of a threat to themselves, so they actually promote and hire them more. Alternatively, if you're someone who's from the same group, you look at baby-facedness as a sign of weakness. So the evidence seems to suggest that white men who are evaluating other white men look at baby-faced white men as though they are weak. So this insane finding is that baby-faced white men are actually disadvantaged in a white-dominated world, whereas baby-faced black men are more likely to climb up the hierarchy because they're viewed as less of a threat because they're viewed as part of the out-group. Now, all of this is part of a root problem, which is racism, which we have to actually address because that's the real cause of all of this. But the symptoms are things that we can deal with more effectively in the short term. So one way that we can think about this, for example, is by anonymizing promotions and recruitment. I teach at University College London, and all of my students' essays are completely anonymized. All I see is a number. So I don't know whether I'm grading a woman, a man, someone who is black or white or from South Indian origin, whatever it is. It can be anyone. And as a result of that, it means that I can't have my biases creep in. All of us have some level of bias. So in recruitment and promotion, I would argue that whenever possible, we can reduce some of these effects by anonymizing CVs, anonymizing evaluations, and even anonymizing schoolwork as young as possible because teachers are biased. It's not their fault, it's all of us are biased, but teachers are biased too. So if we want to have a world that is more equitable and just and has greater representation and more fairness towards leadership selection, we have to think from the bottom up. We have to think from bias at the lowest levels in school, in exams, all the way to the top levels in headhunting and recruitment and elections. And all of that is subject to bias. The faster that we think about those problems, the more we're going to solve the Snowy Peaks problems, and that creates a virtuous cycle. Because as you get more representation at the higher level, more people who are diverse and have backgrounds that are not typical of the leadership in a Fortune 500 company throw their hat in the ring and think, yes, I too could be someone who's the CEO of this company.
How can physical appearance affect our preference for leaders?
So one of the problems that we have to grapple with is why we so often are drawn to the wrong leaders. And the answer, unfortunately, is that we have all sorts of stupid biases when it comes to leadership selection. One of them is that we evaluate people based on how they look and how their face looks. So there's one crazy study that has been replicated, it's in the top journals in science, and it looks at how people evaluate leaders based exclusively on how their face looks. So what these researchers did was they showed a series of children pictures. And they said, we want you to pick who's going to be in charge of your imaginary ship as a captain in this video game simulation. What the kids didn't know is that the pictures they were shown were not random. One of the faces was the winner of an election, and the other face was the runner-up, the person who came in second in that election. But what was astonishing was that the overwhelming majority of the time, the kids, just on the faces alone, picked the winner to captain their ship. When they replicated the study with adults, they found the same thing, that people were literally choosing victors of elections based on faces, and that you could predict who would win an election based on all sorts of features like face, height, etc. So when we think about why we pick certain leaders, appearance matters enormously. And this is why there is a cottage industry in China of something called the white guy in a tie problem. The white guy in a tie problem is where Chinese businessmen have started to pay white people with no qualifications to pretend that they are businessmen who have flown in from California or Silicon Valley or New York to give a veneer of credence and credibility to a new project. So I interviewed a man named Mitch Moxley, who's a journalist who was a freelancer in China. He had no business background whatsoever. He certainly had no background in quality control, but he was approached and asked to fly to this town of Dongying and to end up in a position of quality assurance manager, basically, an investment guru for this project. So he arrives in this place, and his job was basically to sit around in a waiting area for the better part of the day, except for when prospective investors would arrive at the half-completed building site. And at that point, he would spring into action and would don his tie, go out in his knockoff Dolce & Gabbana vest. I think it was called Dolo & Gabbana with an 8 in the middle by accident. And what he did was he would go and pretend to be a businessman from California. And this would lead the investors to think, wow, this is a really important project. Our money is safe because this white person thinks that it's worth investing in. So throughout China, there's a series of appearances like this. One of the other insane ones is a person who was a documentary filmmaker who was tasked with fronting a country western band, even though he played the clarinet, which, as you may know, is not a staple of most country western music. And the lead singer was a Spanish woman who didn't speak English and couldn't sing, but they were white. So they were brought out to various openings as though the band Traveler, a fake band, would give credibility to these ribbon-cutting ceremonies. And Mitch Moxley, the white guy in a tie that I interviewed, said to me, you know, the building site that we were at wasn't even finished, so we held this ribbon-cutting ceremony, and we have no idea what they were celebrating because nothing was open, and it was all basically this fake business venture. So it comes back to this fundamental point, which is that appearances unfortunately do matter. And this means that our evaluation of leaders needs to be scrutinized very heavily because we have stupid voices in our heads that are telling us information that we should not process as though it actually matters, and yet we do process as though it actually matters, based on face, based on height, based on race, based on gender. And once we accept that leadership selection is not something that happens in our heads based on merit and skills and competence, we can start to counteract that. So I think this evidence, this research should be center stage in any organization that involves recruitment of people in power, promotion, or evaluation of people who have been leaders for some time. Because when we think about those areas, we often go on autopilot. We just sort of do what was done in the past. We do the same job advertisement. We do the same interview scheme. And we end up replicating these biases. So when we go around and scratch our heads, why do we keep getting the wrong leaders? There are many reasons, but one of them is that we have cognitive biases in how we evaluate prospective leaders, and those can be fixed, not by manipulating our brains, but by confronting them head on rather than ignoring them and pretending that they don't exist.
Who is Steve Rauchi, and what are the dark triad traits?
The story of Steve Rauchi, a psychopathic janitor, is one that starts in the classroom of a man I spoke to named Rich Agnello. And Rich Agnello is a teacher in the Schenectady, New York school district who was grappling with a problem that his classroom was far too cold. The district was trying to reduce its energy bills, so they had been shutting off the heat. And Agnello just finally, after lots of complaints had gone unanswered, he took matters into his own hands and he bought a space heater and plugged it into the wall and tried to heat up the classroom himself. And one day he comes into work and he feels this sort of presence behind him lurking. And he turns around, and the man behind him is Steve Rauchi. And Steve Rauchi is fuming that he has taken it upon himself to install what Rauchi says is an illegal space heater. And Rauchi was furious at him because he was worried that this would drive up the district energy bill. So this begs the question of, who is Steve Rauchi, and how is he ending up in this position where he's yelling at someone who's just trying to make their classroom hospitable for their students? Now, Steve Rauchi starts as a janitor, but he is someone who quite clearly has what we call the dark triad traits. The dark triad is known as these three traits of Machiavellianism, the ends justifies the means, psychopathy, or being a psychopath, and narcissism, the idea that you have this massive ego and the world revolves around you and you have a need for recognition. Now, Steve Rauchi isn't content with being a janitor. So he hatches a series of schemes to try to quickly climb up the ranks in the stage of power that he cares about, which is the Schenectady, New York School District. So what he starts to do is to come up with this plot to unseat the district energy czar. So the district energy czar is someone who's tasked with saving money by reducing the district's energy bills. And this person who's currently in the role is just trying to do his job, but he doesn't really understand the software that manages the electricity usage. So Rauchi learns the software. He sort of becomes an expert on it. And he uses this expertise to say to this other person, don't worry, I'll take care of the software. I'll set it up for you. I'll make sure that all of this goes just the right way. But what Rauchi is actually doing is ramping up energy usage. He's switching the stadium lights at the football field on at various odd times of the night or on public holidays, trying to just use so much more juice that basically the person gets fired from their job because the cost goes up. And he succeeds in doing this. He basically hatches this incredible scheme, this elaborate plot to frame his colleague as being incompetent. The district gets rid of the old colleague and puts Rauchi in charge of the energy czar position. So now Rauchi has climbed up the ranks, his pay has gone up, he manages more people, but he's not content there. So he decides he wants to become a major figure in the union. And as a result, he tries to run for union president, but someone has the audacity to denounce him. And they denounce him because he's this atrocious boss who basically harasses his employees and does all sorts of crazy things like trying to cut the cords of space heaters in classrooms. Now, because of this, the district is sort of alerted to this fact that Rauchi might be a bit of a psychopath. And rather than responding to this in a normal way, as many of us would, trying to sort of, counteract these claims or object to them, Rauchi does something else. He figures out who's written this letter, crossing him, and he then goes to their house in the middle of the night, as far as we know from the evidence, and he paints the word rat on the outside of their house in spray paint. And then, not content to just have done this to his colleague, he forces his subordinates to get into a school district van during school hours and drive to see the word rat written on their house so that they can all see what happens to people who cross Steve Rauchi. Now, Steve Rauchi is also not a normal person in a variety of daily interactions. He laments in some of the recorded conversations that we have from law enforcement efforts later on that he really is very sad that he didn't have a twin, because then he could have had someone like Steve Rauchi in his life. He also puts a picture of the Godfather behind his desk because he sees himself as the Godfather. And he's quite smart about how he ends up silencing his critics by doling out various sums of money when people are financially strapped so that he literally becomes the Godfather for people in his school district. Now, over time, this gets out of complete control. People start to cross him, and the enemies face retribution that goes beyond spray paint. At one point, he places an explosive on the car of one of his colleagues. In another point, the district and the police actually intervene at the last minute when they realize that he actually has explosives in his office inside of this high school during school hours. He also has night vision goggles, which are not exactly the kind of thing you need to clean the gymnasium, but are very useful if you're going to sneak off and plant explosives and spray paint your colleagues' houses. He slashes the tires of people who cross him, and there's this one great quote where he says, very threatening to this colleague, "Nice little truck you've got there, nice little trucky truck, and it'd be a shame if something happened to it." And then indeed, in the dead of night, the tires are slashed by Steve Rauchi. Now, he's eventually prosecuted for having explosives in a school district, an incredibly horrific potential crime in the making, but also for all of the various crimes that he committed while he was in this position, and the lives that he ruined, the people who were destroyed because they were so scared of going to work with someone who was just in charge of a district maintenance office in Schenectady, New York. Now, Steve Rauchi ended up in prison. He was sentenced to multiple decades in jail. And since then, he has accepted the fact that he is a psychopath with dark triad traits. And he's the emblem, I think, of many of these traits. People who are narcissistic, Machiavellian psychopaths. Now, this world of the dark triad is an extremely complex one. It's something where we only have a real approximation for these traits, and you can't easily just look at someone and point at them and say they're a psychopath. Now, part of the reason for that is because Steve Rauchi is what I would call an unsuccessful psychopath. And that's because Steve Rauchi was unable to control his impulses. He was unable to sort of dial it back when he needed to. He was unable to blend in as a normal functioning member of his staff, and instead did all sorts of crazy things that made people realize that he was probably a psychopath. The successful psychopaths are in boardrooms, they're managing hedge funds, they're in politics. They're the people who are ruthless, who are very power hungry, and are very good at getting power because, like Steve Rauchi, they're able to hatch extremely complicated plots in order to get their way. They're extremely disciplined at times when they're successful psychopaths to get their way, to engineer the outcome they desire. So the successful psychopaths are the worst of every world. They're people who are terrible at wielding power, extremely abusive, very likely to inflict damage on the people who are their subordinates. And yet they're successful because they have just the right amount of discipline and sort of wherewithal to understand when to stop acting like a psychopath. Now, the other problem with psychopaths in terms of detecting and deterring them is that they all have this trait. And when you open any sort of journal article or textbook, or you speak to an expert on psychopaths, the two words that always jump out at you are superficial charm. Superficial charm refers to this knack that psychopaths have to make people like them, particularly in short bursts. And Steve Rauchi did have this in short bursts. So whether you're unsuccessful or successful, you manage to make people like you because you're so keen to manipulate them that it enters a core part of your thinking. How could I make this person like me so that I can manipulate them for my own ends later? Now, the problem with this is, of course, that superficial charm blinds us to psychopaths. When you see some unsuccessful psychopaths, so for example, Ted Bundy is one of the quintessential unsuccessful psychopaths, someone who scored near the top of the psychopathy score. One of them is a score that goes out of 40. Ted Bundy is one of the few people to reach 39 on that scale. Incredibly psychopathic, mass serial killer, horrible person who inflicted incredible damage on society and killed lots and lots of people. But everybody who talked about Ted Bundy after he was caught said some variation of the same thing. He seemed so charming. He seemed so nice. And indeed, that was part of his success. He was able to lure victims to his car precisely because he was superficially charming. So that creates a wrinkle for us in trying to solve this problem. How do we spot psychopaths? How do we spot people with the dark triad? And the answer is it's not easy. There are measures. So there's sophisticated questionnaires that are used to try to evaluate psychopaths, but there are 12 questions that are sometimes used for a survey called the Dirty Dozen. And these 12 questions, if answered honestly, do indicate a reasonable approximation of whether you have some psychopathic or dark triad traits. Now, the problem is that people lie. And especially psychopaths who are trying to blend in as ordinary people so they can get away with it, they have a distinct incentive to lie on these questionnaires, which is why clinical psychopathy investigations, trying to assess psychopathy of people who are in prison for horrific crimes, are much more intrusive, much more combative. They try to throw people off. They cross-check information. They do a lot of things to try to make sure that they are not just misdiagnosing someone based on lies. And one of the real problems that comes up with psychopathy is that it's not just somebody who is mean or immoral, or a bad person. It's much deeper than that. The dark triad, and psychopathy in particular, are a neurological disorder. Your brain does not function normally. And one of the most striking illustrations of that is when you look at psychopathy surveys and research and MRI scans, brain scans, of people who are psychopaths compared to people who are not psychopaths. So if you take somebody and you put them into an MRI scanner, you can look at how their brain is reacting to various things that they're shown. So what these researchers did was they decided to put a series of known psychopaths, people who had scored off the charts on the psychopathy diagnostic tests, into a brain scanner, an MRI machine, and then to show them horrific images of children suffering, animals being abused, all the kinds of things that make our skin crawl. And what they found with the psychopaths was that their brains didn't really light up that much. They were mostly unaffected by these images. Then they put normal people into those scanners, and their brains lit up like a firework. I mean, anguish, empathy, all sorts of emotions are just flooding in to the scans. It looks extremely colorful because everybody is reacting to these horrific images. So then there's a little bit of a wrinkle here that's fascinating, which is then the researchers had this brainwave. They said, how is it possible that these psychopaths who don't feel empathy, who don't feel for these children and animals who are suffering, can put on superficial charm to make us like them? Surely empathy is part of that. So what they did was they said, okay, we're gonna stick you back in the brain scanner, but this time we want you to imagine what it would be like to feel for those suffering individuals that are depicted in these films we're about to show you. And all of a sudden, the psychopath's brains looked like a normal brain. They were able to switch on empathy by choice. So for the rest of us, we have to make a conscious decision to downregulate our empathy. We have to make a decision to say, you know what, I'm going to harm somebody, I'm gonna fire them or break up with them, and I'm gonna have to consciously try to make myself feel less bad for them because it's switched on by default. For psychopaths, it tends to be switched off by default, but they're actually really good at mimicking a normal brain if and when they need to. And this is the origin of the superficial charm. So what you have is a world in which, for small and short interactions, psychopaths are very good not just at passing, but at actually making us like them more than many other people. This is why, by the way, the job interview is a terrible way of sorting out people, because the job interview is a performance for a very short period of time. And what psychopaths are extremely good at doing is making people like them, especially because they're chameleon-like. They can sort of morph depending on what they think people want to hear in this short period of time. Most job interviews that ask the standard questions with psychopaths can manipulate and sort of anticipate, and in which they can present themselves as different in different contexts based on what the interviewers want to hear. That is like rolling the red carpet out to people with the dark triad, because they are superficially charming, they're ruthless, so they will say whatever they think needs to be said in order to get the job, and they're narcissistic, so they're very attuned to what other people think about them. It's the worst of every world. And so the dark triad is a serious problem. It's one that we understand reasonably well, but it's still difficult to measure for most people. And yet, we don't think carefully about systems that anticipate that these people are out there, they're more likely to seek power, and they're much better than the rest of us at getting it.
Can psychopathy ever be a beneficial trait?
There's one argument that's often made with psychopaths that says that they're just in the wrong profession if they end up as a leader. And instead, what they should be doing is something else. So for example, psychopaths don't react in high-stress situations the same way the rest of us do. Just as they have empathy switched off, they tend to react less to stress. So you can imagine a world in which some people think, let's just put psychopaths in charge of bomb defusal. Let's embed them with special forces and they go off and they defuse bombs, because while the rest of us have our palms sweating and we're hearts racing and we can't focus because we're about to get blown up, psychopaths don't really react in those situations. They have a much steadier hand. They don't get flustered in those moments. So maybe there is something to that. The problem, of course, is that would you really want a special forces detail that has a psychopath that's heavily armed in a war zone in the moment? Maybe good at bomb defusal, maybe bad at everything else. So the same is, of course, true for surgeons. Maybe it's the case that it's very easy for a psychopath to slice somebody up without thinking of them as a person, and therefore they're less affected by the blood, less affected by the sort of inevitable empathy and humanity, and more able to sort of just get on with the cold, hard detail of the task at hand. On the other hand, if I put that to you as a hypothetical proposition, it's one thing if I say to you, hello, meet your surgeon. They're a psychopath. Enjoy. They're going to be great at operating on you. I don't think that many people would sign up for that surgery or accept that as an outcome.
Why might some psychopathy be beneficial to leaders?
There are some people who make the argument that a little dose of psychopathy can make you better as a ruler. And the argument goes like this, that if you're absolutely inundated or flooded with empathy every decision you make, you can't be a rational thinker. On the other hand, if you're somebody who's scoring off the charts in being a psychopath, you're going to have no empathy. And that's a terrible thing for a leader. So there may be some sort of Goldilocks solution of just the right amount of empathy, that you can make a decision that is not clouded exclusively by sentiment, but is also driven by rationality, but that the sentiment doesn't disappear. It still exists. It's still part of your thought process. Now, the realm of research that's really interesting on this proposition is something called psychological distance. And this is the idea that you should be at a sort of optimal level of psychological distance from the people that you're in charge of. What I mean by this is, if you imagine that you're in charge of a country or a major international corporation, the people who are affected by your decisions are abstractions. You never see them, you never talk to them. They're just sort of names on a spreadsheet or data points in a database. And as a result of that, it sort of changes your thinking. When we think about individuals we know in our ordinary lives, people are not abstractions. So when it comes time to have to inflict harm on them by, for example, breaking bad news or firing them in a company, somebody that you've known for 10 years is hard to fire, because there's this whole sort of interesting tapestry of what that individual is like. You feel for them. Now, as a result of that, you don't want to have an unrealistic world in which CEOs spend all their time shaking the hands and getting to know the family history of every possible employee. But what you do want to have is a bit of reminders built in to your leadership that give you that optimal level of psychological distance where, for example, if you have to make a decision that affects people at a factory thousands of miles away, go to the factory. Understand that the consequences of your decision are affecting real people. That kind of reminder is crucial for good leadership, because unless you are a psychopath, those instances will temper your decision making. They'll make you think harder about your choices. I think that power should be a burden to ordinary people. I think it should actually be costly in the sense of psychology. In other words, if you think that power is easy and fun, you're the wrong person for the job. Because everybody at the highest levels of power is, no matter what they do, ruining some lives and making some other lives much better. It's a distributional choice. If you're the president of a country or if you're the CEO in charge of a major corporation, your decisions affect people's lives for better or worse. And some of those effects are catastrophic. You should have to live with that. It should weigh on you. If it doesn't weigh on you, you haven't done your job right. You have not developed a system in which the psychological distance you face is actually at the right level. So psychopaths can't be fixed in this regard. No matter how much a psychopath gets to know somebody, they just don't care about them. So if you have a psychopath in charge, psychological distance doesn't solve the problem. For everyone else, it's a key ingredient in making sure that you perform better if you end up in a position of leadership.
Do the dark triad traits always occur together in individuals?
The dark triad traits are really interesting because you can disaggregate them into their three parts, which are Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy, being a psychopath. Now, these traits can occur in elevated levels in isolation. So you could just be somebody who's more Machiavellian than the rest of the population. You could just be more narcissistic. And there's some really interesting findings when you actually control for them in isolation. So Machiavellian people tend to be better at getting power. They tend to be better at getting power because they're strategic thinkers. They're people who have a game plan. They start to think, how can I get to my goal? And if they're disciplined, which psychopaths, by the way, often are not, they're much more impulsive. But if you're a Machiavellian non-psychopath, you can control your impulses. You can think into the future. You can strategize. So Machiavellianism alone is probably actually helpful for getting power. Doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be the best at wielding it because everything is strategic. And then narcissists are different again. Narcissists, if they occur in isolation, can actually help you make more money. And the reason for that is because narcissists are hyper attuned to what other people think of them. So we like to imagine that we live in a purely meritocratic world, but we don't. So therefore, advancement in hierarchies often can depend on how much other people like you, particularly in places where the system is a bit more regimented, right? If you try to get ahead in a palace in Belarus, you better be ruthless and not very nice. If you try to get ahead in a regulated Fortune 500 company in the United States, probably sometimes beneficial for people to like you. Narcissists are good at making people like them. So the evidence seems to suggest that narcissism in isolation can be helpful for improving your paycheck, even though it might not be the best thing for making good decisions, because you have a warped view of what's the most important, and for narcissists, the most important thing is themselves. Now, psychopathy on its own, without the Machiavellian narcissistic component, is reasonably rare. They tend to correlate. But when you do have people who are just psychopaths, they're more impulsive, and they're more willing to take risks than other people. As a result of that, you tend to have lots of unsuccessful psychopaths. The successful ones who make it, who survive, they're not good at wielding power, but they are often pretty good at obtaining it because they are power hungry. So a psychopath in isolation is not someone you want in charge of a company. It is not as bad to have somebody who's just Machiavellian or as bad to have someone who's just narcissistic. But for the most part, if you're high on the psychopathy score, you're usually pretty high on the narcissism and Machiavellian score as well. So while these things can be studied independently, the areas of power that we're most interested in tend to be clustered around those with the dark triad. And by the way, when there have been analyses that have been done about people who actually are in power currently, those people disproportionately score much higher on the scores of the dark triad and psychopathy than the general public. Depending on the study you look at, psychopaths are between 4 times and 100 times more represented in positions of power than everybody else. So we've clearly got this all wrong. we have clearly designed systems that are not doing an effective job at screening these people out or weeding them out once they get into power. As a result of that, we have people in power who have no business being there at a much greater rate than the general population.
How common are the dark triad traits amongst dictators?
One of the interesting things about my job is I go around the world and sometimes I sit down with former heads of state in authoritarian countries, people who basically were dictators or despots until a few years ago. And what's striking about these people is that they have basically inhabited the ideal world for a Machiavellian narcissistic psychopath, somebody with the dark triad traits. And the reason that they have inhabited the right job for that person is because there's no constraints on their ability to abuse other people. They walk around the world, and every time they walk into a room, people stand up and cheer. The narcissist in them gets applauded. When they're basically coming to power, they have to scheme and think about their rivals and how to outfox them and beat them and destroy them. So the Machiavellian side gets kicked into gear and rewarded. And then a psychopath is tailor-made to be a dictator. Because dictators, to stay in power, often have to be ruthless. They often have to inflict immense amounts of damage on people. And psychopaths relish that. They don't just do that half-heartedly, they actually enjoy it. And as a result of that, a lot of the most ruthless dictators are very likely people with extraordinarily elevated traits from the dark triad. Now, unfortunately, and this is an area that I think would be fascinating for future research, we haven't been able to line up all the dictators of the world and stick them in an MRI machine and see how their brains function compared to the rest of us. But I would guess, based on my interactions with them and interviews of sitting down with many of these people, that they are psychopaths, many of them. Now, one of the interesting things that's also worth noting is that psychopaths have this thing called illusory control, which means they believe that the ordinary risks don't apply to them because they're smarter than everyone else. They're more strategic. If everybody else is facing consequences from a problem, they won't face those same consequences because they can get away with it. They can outsmart consequences. As a result of that, when you think about places that are more risky to inhabit when it comes to power, you're going to have an amplified effect of psychopaths seeking those positions. So for dictators, for example, I crunched the numbers in my own research. What you see is that being a dictator is a really dangerous thing. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, one of the things that you see is over a span of 50 years that I studied, about 40%, 43% to be precise, of dictators who lost power ended up either exiled, jailed, or killed. So it's effectively a coin flip whether this terrible thing happens to them when they lose power. Now, ordinary people look at those odds, a coin flip, and your life is destroyed, and they think, maybe not for me. But if you're a psychopathic Machiavellian narcissist, you think, well, yeah, that happened to them, but it wouldn't never happen to me because I'm much smarter and cleverer than them. And anyone who tries to come after me, I'm going to torture or abuse them. So what you end up having is in positions of power that are particularly dangerous, psychopaths are much more likely to seek those positions of power because they don't view the danger as a threat to them. So I expect that psychopathy is doubly overrepresented in positions like dictatorships, partly because it's a job that they would relish and enjoy, and partly because they don't believe the risks of being a dictator actually apply to them, and that they can outsmart everybody else and avoid the consequences that tend to be inflicted when inevitably that despot topples from their palace and loses the throne.
How can systems help us select better leaders?
One of the things that was really frustrating when I was researching this book was encountering all sorts of evidence that there are little tweaks and changes that can fix some of these problems, that can make it so power is more attractive to the right kinds of people and that we end up with better leaders in power in the end. I think part of the problem is we don't systematically evaluate these questions when we have choices about who to recruit or how to hire someone or how to promote someone. And so there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there. Part of it is just having a serious systematic evaluation of what you did in the past and how that might introduce biases into promoting and attracting the right kinds of people into power. So, for example, whenever we think about how we recruit for a job, overwhelmingly we just do what we did last time. We just have the same job advert, the same approach, the same system. Additionally, when we end up with abusive power scandals, right? These happen all the time. I mean, it was one of these things when you're writing a book about how power is dysfunctional. I wasn't very worried about this not being in the news when it came out because it happens all the time. We are constantly disappointed by people in charge. They constantly behave badly. So when you think about that, why is this happening? The easy answer and the wrong place to focus is by just condemning the individual. They were a bad person. How could somebody be so bad? That's usually what the journalistic interpretation of a lot of these abusive powers ends up being. We have a news cycle that says, what a monster. We never think about what system produced this monster? What system attracted this monster in the first place? How did we end up with someone who didn't behave like a monster in the past, but now has? And those questions are much harder to tackle, but they're the right questions to answer. Because ultimately, if we want to end up with a world that is shaped by the best of us, rather than very often the worst of us, we have to think carefully. We have to engineer a system. So what I often will tell people is, imagine that the worst person in the world is trying to get the job that you are advertising for. Imagine that the worst person in the world is running for the political office in your political party or in your election. Now design every system with that idea in mind. That's the way you fix this problem. You try to deter those people from seeking power in the first place. Try to make it unattractive for them. You then have screening processes to try to weed them out during the actual recruitment process. If they manage to wriggle through and end up in a position of power, you have checks and oversight to basically eliminate them from those posts of power if they've made it that far. And then when it comes to promotion and the top jobs, that's where scrutiny has to be the absolute most robust, because those people are the ones who do the most damage. What we tend to also have as a problem is we have our sort of gaze, our scrutiny, our oversight looking downward. The average employee, the average person in society faces intense scrutiny, both in the screening process with lots of training and with the oversight process. Especially after the pandemic, we have loads of people who are sitting at home with various screen monitoring software. There's even some software in some companies that involves chair monitoring devices, incredibly dystopian devices, that check to make sure you are physically sitting in front of your computer when you say you are. And yet when we think about those things that actually destroy society, the Enron scandals, the major abuses of power that rock our societies, Those happen in the places in the corner offices where nobody is checking your chair, no one's monitoring your screen, no one is scrutinizing or screening you. And so we have these really robust checks, these elements of oversight, these tick box exercises we all go through. And yet when it comes to, say, the president or someone who is in charge of nuclear weapons, there's one screen and it's voters, that's it. As long as they're able to pass the voter test, we hand over the nuclear codes. I think in general, we have to rebalance society in these important ways. The first one is to redesign systems as though the worst person in the world is trying to seek power and obtain it. The second is to make sure that we actually have mechanisms in place that are looking upward rather than downward when it comes to scrutinizing people in power. So rather than trying to punish and regulate every person who might steal a paperclip, think about the people who can actually bring the company down and inflict enormous damage on our societies. Those are the people who often face the least scrutiny and the most opacity in how they behave. And that is something we need to fix.
Why are systems so important when it comes to power?
If we're going to focus on fixing this problem, we have to think very carefully about systems, because systems make an enormous difference. Systems make a difference on a few levels. The first is that rotten systems attract rotten people. So there's an amazing study that some economists did where they had students roll a 6-sided dice and report their scores. But because they reported their own scores, they could lie about their scores. And they had an incentive to lie because every time they rolled a 6, they got some money. So this meant that you could do a series of statistical tests and roll the dice 42 times and see how many they reported it, and you could have a pretty good idea of who was lying. There was one student in the study who was so brazen, he reported 42 sixes, which, kudos for at least trying to say that every single dice roll was a 6. But the point here was they then did an evaluation to see how honesty on the dice rolls correlated with future job choice, what career ambitions they had. And what they found was that in places with corrupt civil services, corrupt bureaucracies, they tended to see a very strong correlation between the people who lied about the dice rolls and those who wanted to become civil servants who could then extract bribes, because the system was known for bribery and graft. By contrast, when they conducted the exact same experiment with the dice rolls in systems that are known for extreme scrupulousness and scrutiny, Denmark, for example, they found that the relationship was inverted. All the people who were extremely honest about their dice rolls, those were the people who wanted to become civil servants and public servants. So a rotten system attracts rotten people, and a good system attracts good people. But then once you have the people in place, rotten systems turn people worse much faster than good systems. So when you think about the environment that you're in, if you're in a corrupt police department, if you're in a corrupt bureaucracy, everybody around you is skirting the rules. A lot of the people around you are breaking the rules. They're abusing them. They're inflicting harm. But it's normal. It's what's done. So therefore, all of the things that we know that power does to people in a vacuum, in other words, the way that power generally affects people's psychology and neuroscience and brain chemistry, those things go on steroids. The effect is amplified in a bad system. The other thing that happens is that if you're in a bad system, you have to make worse choices. So if you're the prime minister of Denmark or Sweden, the slate of choices available to you are constrained. You're not going to get away with killing protesters or torturing people. You know that it will end your political career. If you're the prime minister or president of a deeply corrupt dictatorship, everything is different. All of the environment around you is different. It's geared towards corruption and abuse. Ruthlessness is rewarded more, and you know that you're going to get away with a heck of a lot more. So the system is this key mediating factor. Now, the reason I focus on the system so much is not just because it's something that's so important, it is, but also because it's the most straightforward thing to change. Trying to change a psychopath or trying to change a bad leader is hard. Changing systems is something that we can actually achieve. And there's nothing that says that this corrupt police department or this horrible country in which everybody in politics is someone who is skirting the rules, breaking them, or inflicting harm on ordinary citizens, those things are not, God-given truths that are immutable. They can be fixed. And so I think the more that we evaluate systems, the more that we have hope for making power function effectively. Instead, most of what we do when we look at power is we say, this person is bad, let's get them out. And then we end up with another bad person a few minutes later, or a few months later. And as a result of that, we end up replicating the exact same problems over and over and over. The smarter solution is to try to interrogate the system and how it led to the bad person coming to power, and also how it turned otherwise good people bad.
What real-world systems have you observed to learn about power?
So one of the most interesting studies that I came across in researching this book was a study of all places looking at parking tickets for diplomats in the United Nations in New York City. Now, you would not normally think that parking tickets would provide a great insight into abuse of power and all sorts of rival explanations for what power does to people. But it's actually a perfect testing ground. And the reason for that is because you take people from all over the world. Some are from corrupt countries, some are from extremely uncorrupt democracies. And you stick them all together in New York City, where they all face the exact same incentives, because all of them can get away with most crimes because they have diplomatic immunity. Now, this means that if you park your car illegally as somebody with diplomatic immunity, there are no consequences. You don't have to pay a fine, you just have to basically accept as a police officer that no one's going to pay a price for this. Now, by the early 2000s, diplomats in New York City had racked up $18 million of parking tickets, something like 150,000 parking fines that were going unpaid. So Mike Bloomberg, who was then the mayor of New York City, said, it's time to put a stop to this. Let's actually enforce this. We can't violate diplomatic immunity, but we can take away their cars. We can impound them. So all of a sudden, overnight, there is a switch. Enforcement begins, consequences emerge. And you have a natural experiment. What happens before enforcement and what happens after enforcement? And what's really striking about this study is that you see this very large divergence before enforcement depending on the country that the person was from. So if you're from two of the worst violators in this study, Yemen or Egypt, for example, where corruption is rampant and people in power are often not the nicest or the most rule-following, those people racked up hundreds of parking fines per diplomat. I believe the worst country had something like 192 parking offenses per diplomat, a truly astonishing level of illegal parking, much to the chagrin, I'm sure, of all the people who lived in the neighborhood where these people were parking their cars. But then you also had on the other end of the spectrum people who were from, say, Japan or Norway, who basically followed the rules. They were from rule-following cultures, and therefore they didn't really rack up many parking fines. What was amazing is after the consequences were imposed, after the enforcement arrived, there was a convergence. Virtually overnight, everybody started following the rules. Now, this gives us a really nice dose of hope, right? If you have systems that are broken that encourage people to break the rules because they're from a place where people do that, and the system that rewards people who break the rules, right? I mean, to get ahead and to become a diplomat in Egypt is very different from the path that you need to get ahead and become a diplomat in Norway or Japan. There's this wrinkle in the data, and the wrinkle is this. The longer that somebody from Japan or Norway, to take two examples, lived in New York City, the longer they could get away with it in the pre-enforcement period, the more they started to park illegally. So this tells you that there's this absolute intersection between culture, behavior, individuals, and systems. And so when we have this simplistic view of power, we're missing the story. What you really need is a system that attracts the right kind of people, so that the diplomats who are clean and nice and rule-following end up in power. Then you need a system that gives them all the right incentives to follow the rules once they get there. And then, if you do have people who break the rules, there needs to be consequences. So the study from UN diplomats and their parking behavior actually, I think, illuminates a huge amount of very interesting dynamics around power, precisely because they were able to control for so many of these different confounding factors, like where somebody comes from and what their cultural background is, and then looks how enforcement really does create better effects in positions of power.
Why does society often fail to screen out bad leaders?
So one of the things I do outside of my professional life is twice a week I lead tours at a historic site in Britain. I take groups of interested people and I show them the history of this building. It's a volunteer position. And yet, I faced more screening and more oversight for that volunteer tour guide job than just about any politician faces when they actually enter the position that they're going to inhabit. So if you have a president or a prime minister who's won an election, there's no training. There's no oversight. There's no scrutiny other than journalists from the outside. There's often not a criminal background check for politicians before an election. And yet, when you end up as a tour guide, you have all sorts of safeguarding, you have training. I had to spend hours and hours watching videos around reporting and safeguarding. And of course, these things are extremely important. It's not to say that we shouldn't do those things. It's to say, how have we accepted a world in which the person who ends up as a volunteer tour guide has to spend more time doing training and screening exercises and evaluations and background checks than someone who's in charge of the nuclear codes? I think it's absolutely mind-blowing. I also think, by the way, that some of these things around power that I talk about in the book, like power changes your brain chemistry, power changes your psychology, are well-known effects. Why don't we train people to tell them this is about to happen to you? Why don't we tell a prime minister or a president who's just been thrust into the job, look, we understand that you've just won this campaign. You need to take a step back and understand that your mind is about to change. And it's about to change because we know it's about to change based on all sorts of empirical evidence from neuroscience and psychology and all sorts of other sources. And therefore, here's how you can maybe counteract this or mitigate those effects. So I think we have to think carefully about how we recalibrate society such that at a bare minimum, people who are volunteer tour guides face at least the same amount of scrutiny as people who are at the top echelons of power in far more consequential roles than taking a group of people and around a historic site and telling them various interesting facts.
How can we rethink democracy to help us choose better leaders?
So I firmly believe in democracy, which means I think elections are essential and a vibrant part of choosing leaders. I think there are a few things we can do to make them function better, both in the scrutiny process and after someone has come to power. So the first thing is I think we should have some psychological screening at the top jobs. I think that there should be an expectation that people who are about to control nuclear weapons that can literally wipe out our species should at a minimum be subject to a psychological test. Now, voters can still make a choice, right, based on the evaluation of that test, and I would hope that a psychological test with all sorts of red flags would cause voters to make a better decision. But I think that information should at least be out there. I mean, sort of like we think about the general norm that often exists in many political systems of, for example, declaring financial conflicts of interest or releasing tax returns, perhaps we should have a norm around psychological evaluations. Now, the other thing that I think is important is I wish there was a certain question that was asked to people who wanted to wield immense amounts of power that is often not asked. And that question is this: what would it take for you to think that you are no longer necessary in power? In other words, what is the goal that you want to achieve with your power that if you were to achieve it, you would think it's time to step down? And the reason that question is so important is because it would cause most politicians to freeze like deer in the headlights. They've never thought about it. For them, power is the goal. It would expose them as having never thought about it. And for those who do actually answer that question, they would put themselves on the record as what they think their power is for, such that if they actually achieve it, they can retire. And I think that's something that would be a great screening mechanism to see how people answer that question. For the most part, ordinary and decent people who then put themselves forward for a position of power actually have an answer. They actually think about this and they say, the reason I am running to be a member of my local school board is because I want to do X. They have thought about it. It's not because they want to have glory and power and money and to control people and manipulate them, but everybody who's in the highest echelons of power, not everyone perhaps, but most people, I don't think they've thought about that question in quite the same way. I think they think, I am God's gift to power, and therefore I should inhabit this role as long as I can stay here. Which is why politicians tend to cling to power for as long as they possibly can. You don't have that many people bowing out. So it's not that we should just think about psychological tests. We should also do sort of less scientific psychological evaluations that are probed via questions that try to get at the core of why someone is seeking power, exposing those who are power hungry or in it for the wrong reasons. The final thing that I think we should think about is I think we need to have more oversight using randomness. So one of the ideas I propose in the book is to eliminate the problem of self-selection bias by producing shadow bodies of power that provide oversight to the real body of power, but that is randomly selected. So the way I think about this is you've got a board of directors for a company, or you have a Congress or a parliament in a country. Now, I don't think we should replace the people on those boards or in those parliaments or congresses with random assortment of the population, because there's actually specialist knowledge that it takes. But I do think we should have a random selection for oversight. So what I imagine working was you develop a shadow board of directors. You randomly select employees from the company, and you ask them to basically deliberate on the exact same questions with the exact same information as the real board of directors. Then, if the board is making all sorts of bad decisions for the wrong reasons, or they're blinded by quarterly profits or something else, the shadow board won't make the same decisions because there's no self-selection bias. They're actually closer to the company. They understand the functioning of the business, and they have a longer, what's called a time horizon. They're looking forward into the future more. The same is true for politicians, right? So if we have a problem of corruption or partisanship or ideology skewing political decisions, a random assortment of, say, 435 people of a shadow House of Representatives in the United States would iron out some of those problems. They'd be more compromise-driven. They wouldn't be obsessed with power. They would come up with solutions. And when somebody who's a politician awards a contract to their buddy because they think they'll just give them a little kickback and a couple $1 million in government contracts, the shadow parliament or the shadow House of Representatives would never do that because they don't know the people who are the lobbyists or the contractors. Now, this wouldn't solve the problem because they wouldn't actually have power, but it would expose the problem. It would provide oversight in a way that's really, really useful, such that a journalist could then sit down with a politician and say, look, why have you been unable to come up with a compromise solution when this random assortment of ordinary people did so in a matter of a week? Or why did you give out this contract to this company that happens to be headed up by your friend from, the cricket team or the baseball team, and yet the assortment of people that we randomly selected gave the contract to a much more competent company with a longer track record of public service? So the idea here is that you have to think carefully about screening people who are seeking power. You have to have psychological tests for the highest levels of power. And you also have to ask questions of people that would expose whether they're in it for the sake of power or they're in it for themselves. And far too often, people are in it for themselves, and psychological tests would expose the fact that they are people who are not the ones that you want at the helm of a company or a country or with the sole control of nuclear weapons.
Does policing attract people who are more likely to abuse power?
One of the areas that abuse of power has shown up a lot in the news recently is with police abuse. And indeed, in the spring of 2020, there was the horrific murder of George Floyd in my hometown of Minneapolis. And one of the things that's been discussed around police reform is how we can make this stop, how we can end up fixing policing. A lot of the discussion is on a part of the problem that absolutely warrants attention, but is only part of the problem, and that's what the police do. So this involves solutions like putting body cameras on police officers, oversight, scrutiny, basically, trying to make it so that there's deterrence to stop police officers abusing their position. What we don't think about often is not what the police do, but who the police are, which is a precursor to the question of who we put into a body camera vest, for example. The way I came to this problem was to look at how recruitment of police officers determines who ends up in the uniform. And I was scouring across the United States and looking at various police departments, and one that stood out to me is this small suburb of Atlanta called Doraville, Georgia. And Doraville, Georgia's got about 10,000 people. Its crime rate is pretty much the national average. In most years, there are no murders. It's not a crime-ridden hotspot. Now, when you used to click on Doraville's website for the police department, you were greeted with this video that is quite frankly insane. It is a video in which the first thing you see is a literal tank screaming into view with the Punisher logo, which is the comic book anti-hero vigilante who tortures criminals. The Punisher logo juxtaposed against this backdrop of a tank with the SWAT team inside of it screaming across the frame. Then the people in the SWAT team's tank get out of the hatch. They're in military uniforms, they're carrying assault weapons, and they toss smoke grenades out of the vehicle. They shoot their weapons, and the whole thing is set to the soundtrack of death metal music. When you think about this video, you look at it and you think, who looks at this video and thinks, that looks like a job I want to have? Right? It is not a normal reaction to look at that video and think, yes, I want to be that person who's screaming around my small town in a SWAT team tank with the Punisher mentality, throwing smoke grenades out at the local Walmart, right? But what that does is it creates a magnet to exactly those people. The people who look at that video and think, wow, that looks cool. I'd love to drive around Walmart in a tank with a smoke grenade and a huge weapon. They sign up. Right? So what you have is this self-selection effect on steroids with policing if you don't think about it carefully. Now, New Zealand thought about it carefully. So I spoke to people in my research who had designed a system of recruitment that they called Do You Care Enough to Be a Cop? They shelled out a few $1 million on a very glitzy series of videos and an ad campaign. And the ad campaign is very funny. If you want to go on YouTube and look at this Do You Care Enough to Be a Cop scheme, it's worth watching the videos. Basically what they start with is this very funny video in which police officers are chasing an unseen suspect. The police officers, by the way, depicted in the video are not overwhelmingly white men. There's a lot of women, there's a lot of ethnic minorities, particularly from the underrepresented Maori community. And the officers are chasing the suspect, but stopping to help people cross the street, dancing with someone with a boombox for a bit, telling jokes that are quite funny. And then at the end of the video, they finally catch the perpetrator, which turns out to be a border collie who's stolen a woman's purse, and the dog has the purse in its mouth, its jaws. And Do You Care Enough to Be a Cop flashes on the screen. Now, the juxtaposition with the Punisher logo and the tank compared to the Border Collie and the Do You Care Enough to Be a Cop logo is so extreme that it's almost amusing. It's two parallel worlds of policing that are drastically different. And what happened in New Zealand was that the number of recruits shot through the roof. Their applicant pool expanded dramatically. The distribution of applicants also expanded. Many more women, many more ethnic minorities. Personality types changed. People who didn't previously see themselves as police officers started to think, I could do that job because I care about the community. As a result, it started to decrease the rates of tension and violence between the police community and the ethnic minority community, specifically the Maoris in New Zealand, the indigenous community, that had in the past had bad relations with the police. So what I think is the takeaway from this video juxtaposition is that sometimes there's low-hanging fruit. It's not that we can ignore what the police do. We absolutely have to have oversight and very close scrutiny of police officers who abuse their authority. But at the same time, we have to think more carefully about who ends up in the uniform to begin with. And this is something that is clearly shown by the data when you see that the rates of domestic abuse among police officers in the United States is higher than the general average in the public. So, when you think about why that's happening, perhaps it's that the job is making them a bit more on edge or causing them to behave in certain ways. I think what's more likely is that people who are abusive are disproportionately likely to seek out a job in which you can abuse people. Now, this is not to say that police officers are bad people, but it is to say that for the slice of the population that is abusive, especially the people who like to wield power and carry a gun and terrorize people, for them, as one of the police officers in London told me, who's in charge of recruitment for the Metropolitan Police, she said to me, look, if you're an abusive bigot, policing is an attractive career choice. It doesn't mean that police officers are generally abusive bigots. It means that for that slice of the population, they like the idea of being able to professionally abuse people. So that means you have ever more important scrutiny and ever more important screening for who becomes a cop in the first place. That aspect of recruitment is often not part of the discussion. So I think we absolutely have to think about what the police do, but we also have to devote just as much attention to who the police are.
How do you believe we can improve policing?
It's been really interesting seeing the reaction to my discussion about police recruitment because I've been criticized from sort of both ends. On one end of the spectrum, people say that this is anti-police because the data show that some certain types of people are more attracted to policing who frankly shouldn't be in a uniform, and therefore I'm trying to paint the police as some group of bad people, which is not what I'm saying. On the other end of the spectrum, politically, people are saying this is naive. Policing is fundamentally going to have these problems because the institution of policing was set up to abuse people. So you have the sort of right-wing critique and the left-wing critique. And what I think is important to understand here is that there is a happy ground in the middle of what we're looking at with policing. And that happy ground involves better oversight and better recruitment. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that my proposals mean that we will never have police abuse, we will never have police violence. These are deeply ingrained problems. Police departments in the United States in particular have a long history of racism and violence. And that's not going to go away. But I think we can make them better. And I think that's the point of everything that I talk about in this book, is I do not believe we will ever live in a world where power functions perfectly. I do not believe that we'll ever live in a world where people with badge and a gun, or people behind the Oval Office, or people who are in positions of immense power in business are all angels. That's never going to happen. I do think that we are not picking the low-hanging fruit of how we address some of these problems. And that means that we have to think more carefully about how we can make marginal improvements that add up. Now, yes, screening will help. No, it will not solve policing in the United States. Yes, advertisements that are much more geared towards good people trying to serve their community for policing will help. No, it will not counteract decades and decades of perceptions that the police are not friendly to minority communities in the United States, and in fact often will terrorize people in minority communities in certain departments. So this is a problem that is very complicated, but we have to think about it more deeply if we're going to solve it. And one area that I think is also important to think about is it's a chicken or an egg problem. Because who decides to become a police officer is partly determined by who is currently a police officer. Not just because the police behave in the communities in a way that creates impressions of what the police do, but also because the demographic makeup of police officers determines who ends up trying to go for that job in the first place. So one of the hotspots in horrific police abuse in the past was in Ferguson, Missouri, for example. And in Ferguson, Missouri, there was a high-profile police killing, and the community was overwhelmingly black, and the police department was overwhelmingly white. And when you have those huge juxtapositions of demographic imbalance, it creates a compounded problem. Because if you have a department that is killing black people, that's largely full of white officers, trying to recruit black officers into the ranks becomes harder, because they see policing both as a place where they don't belong and a place where that institution hurts people like themselves. So you have to fix both ends of the problem. You have to make police behave better so that people want to be officers, and you have to present policing as though it is better so that people apply when they are publicly minded as public servants rather than people who like the idea of holding power with a badge and a gun.
How can thought experiments help us evaluate the decisions of our leaders?
If you've ever taken any sort of class in philosophy or read a basic philosophy book, you tend to encounter two thought experiments that try to test our moral intuitions. And they're called the trolley problem, or perhaps also the screaming baby problem. The trolley problem goes like this. You see a trolley or a train barreling down the tracks, and it's heading towards an individual who's on the tracks. And you have the power to divert the train, but if you move it, it might hit somebody else. Now, the trolley problem, as it's often formulated, is that there are two people on one set of tracks where the train is headed, and if you pull the lever and divert the train, it will hit somebody else, but just one person. And the question is, do you pull the lever? Do you divert the train? A similar moral conundrum is posed as the screaming baby problem. And this is an idea where you imagine you're hiding from some government troops who are trying to find you to kill you. And you're in some sort of, dystopian fascist regime. Now, all of a sudden, as you're hiding, one of the babies starts to cry. And the question that is posed by this thought experiment is, do you smother the baby in order to save everybody else? Because you know that if you're discovered, everybody dies, including the baby. And if you don't smother the baby, it guarantees that you will be discovered. So the thought experiment is trying to test our intuitions about utilitarianism, about how should we behave when we face impossible choices. Now, the reason this refers to leaders very often is because if you've reached the highest echelons of power, the people below you have not done their job if they're giving you problems that have easy solutions. Every time that you are the president or the prime minister of a country or you're in charge of an enormous corporation, you should be dealing with problems that are exclusively like the trolley problem, problems that only have bad outcomes. Because that's what you're paid to do. You're basically paid to deal with what's the least bad choice. Now, one of the things that we often do as armchair critics of leaders is we often tend to just say, that leader is bad because they chose something that led to a bad outcome. So they made a choice and something horrific happened. That's the stupid way of thinking about leadership evaluation. And the reason it's stupid is because all we can really think about, to be fair, is what were the alternatives? Did the leader make a bad choice that was the best choice available, or did they make a bad choice that was bad even in the context of the available information and the available choices? So very often what you have with leaders is that you have condemnation of a bad outcome, and sometimes, not always, right? There's plenty of people who are behaving badly and for the wrong reasons and are inflicting harm without a second thought, but sometimes leaders are really trying. They're genuinely trying to minimize damage, and yet their decision leads to harm. Now, if that harm is less than what the alternative would have been, or it's the best decision based on the available information they had at the time, we should actually praise those leaders because it's exactly the same thing that we would have done. And this is a really useful way of thinking about how we condemn or praise leaders. Don't think, did they do something that caused harm? Do think, would I have made the same decision if I had the same information and I was faced with the same possible choices? If the answer to that question is yes, you should praise the leader because they made the best of a bad situation. And that basically is what it means to be a head of state. Modern presidents and prime ministers are making decisions all the time that hurt people. But they're making decisions that hopefully hurt fewer people than the alternative. And they're doing so in immense uncertainty. They don't know what the outcomes are going to be, and yet they're making the best choice they can. Now, this is not to absolve leaders who inflict harm. We have to enforce the rules. We have to hold people accountable when they break the rules, when they abuse their power. But we should also think carefully about the logic of evaluating leaders and only condemn the leaders who made bad choices relative to the alternatives, not bad choices just because they inflicted harm on people.
Who is Abhisit Vejjajiva, and what do his decisions teach us about power?
One of the people that I've sat down many times with over the last decade is a man named Abhisit Vejjajiva, who is the former prime minister of Thailand. Known by some as a despot because he was overseeing an authoritarian country, he was installed in place, handpicked by generals. Now, I've had coffee with Abhisit in Bangkok 6 or 7 times. I've sat down with him for hours on end. And one of the peculiar things about meeting people like him are that I simultaneously know that he has been accused of doing horrible things. And I also have this experience on a personal level of shaking his hand, laughing at his jokes, getting to know him, and frankly, liking him. And it's a really jarring situation that I find myself in quite often, where I meet with people who are accused of war crimes or are accused of ordering torture or have done horrific things or becoming the worst bioterrorist in American history, for example, that you end up in a situation where you're shaking the hands of someone who's committed monstrous acts, and yet you have to sort of check the fact that you're finding yourself charmed by them or liking them. And that's the moral complexity around leaders that you so often face, particularly in places where all of the choices are bad. Now, Thailand is one of the places where leaders face bad choices. And Abhisit faced an environment in which no matter what he was going to do at this moment of crisis, people were going to die. I picked him as a sort of emblem of this point in the book, precisely because what he did is hard to defend. What he did was he faced a moment of mass uprising and protests a little over a decade ago, when hundreds of thousands of protesters had taken to the streets to oppose the government. Now that's no problem, and that should not be cracked down upon. But within these protest movements, there were heavily armed militias who were smuggling heavy weapons, including things like rocket-propelled grenades, into the crowds and using them. So government forces were being blown up, quite literally, by people who were embedded within these protest camps. Now, the violence was getting completely out of control. Dozens of people were being killed, and many people were starting to talk about a civil war. Now, anyone who understands what civil wars look like knows that thousands, if not tens of thousands of people die in them. It destroys the country. It has years, if not decades, of horrific effects for a country. Now, Abiset had to evaluate the risk of this. What is the likelihood a civil war will happen? And what he told me, these are his words, this is the way that he portrays the decision that he was about to take, was that I was genuinely worried that if I didn't stop the violence, even with a heavy hand, that this would lead to mass casualty events. We're talking hundreds of thousands, at least thousands of people potentially dying. So Abiset's thought process went like this, according to him. I have to stop the chance of a civil war. I have to stop the chance of mass violence spreading out, metastasizing throughout Bangkok, and hundreds of more people dying. Therefore, I'm going to allow a very heavy hand to be used. Now, what he did next makes my skin crawl, and I do not absolve it morally. I think it's horrific. But what he did was he ordered the use of live rounds on protesters, or at least that's what happened. It's murky who exactly gave the order, but it's believed that anyway, it's his responsibility. He was in charge. So live rounds get used on protesters, and just under 100 people get killed. An unbelievable atrocity. Now, I believe that he absolutely should be held accountable for this. It's obviously the case that he was overseeing mass murder of people. But I also think that rather than just simply condemning him, we actually learn more by simultaneously condemning him and trying to understand the thought process that led to this. It's not to absolve him. I have to be very clear about this. This is not a situation where I think Abiset did the right thing. It's that he genuinely faced an alternative that may have been worse. Now, maybe it was only a 5% chance. Maybe it was a 25% chance. Maybe it was a 50% chance that a civil war would happen. We just don't know. And in that moment of uncertainty, he made a catastrophically horrific choice. But the reason I use him in the book is specifically because it made my skin crawl. If you want to have a philosophical and intellectual commitment to evaluating leaders based on alternative choices, you have to put yourself in the shoes of someone who is facing a world in which whatever they choose, people die. And that is what Abiset's choice ultimately was. Now, at the same time, I have a lot of sort of introspection about how I talk about him and write about him because I've sat down with him for hours and hours on end, and I want to make sure that I'm not, writing about him in an overly rosy way because I know him. So I'm trying to be as fair as possible. It would have been very easy to pick an example where people are far less bothered by this. And one example to illustrate this point where we tend to say exactly the same thing that I just said about Abiset, but we say, oh yes, this was definitely the right call, and we should praise this person, is Winston Churchill in World War II. And the reason that this comes to mind is because Winston Churchill had a secret that the Germans didn't know during the middle of the war. The secret was this. They had cracked the Nazi Enigma codes. They had cracked the codes that allowed the British government to actually understand exactly what the Nazis were saying to one another. And the Nazis didn't know this. But the problem is, once the Nazis realize the codes have been cracked, they are 100% immediately going to change the codes. So what do you have to do? You have to keep on pretending that you can't break the codes so that you can use the information when it really matters. So this created real-life trolley problems for Winston Churchill. And one of them was an Australian ship that they knew was about to be torpedoed. They had credible information from the broken codes that the Germans were going to sink this boat. They knew that hundreds of sailors' lives were at risk. Churchill decided not to warn them, because if he warned them and they diverted course, it would be a clue to the Nazis that the codes had been broken. Obviously, it would have been unusual behavior for the ship to change course all of a sudden based on new information. So for the purpose of the war effort, Churchill basically kept silent. He caused the deaths of the people who ultimately did die on that ship. But he did it because he believed, probably rightly, that understanding that the codes had been broken among the Nazi war elite would lead to decisions and changes in their behavior that would cause tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, even millions of more deaths, and the war being prolonged significantly more. So he made an impossible choice. Now, when we think about Churchill, we say, well, it's just the cost of a difficult situation. But Abiset would say the same thing. And my argument here is not that they're necessarily equal. There is a moral difference here because, of course, Some of these may have been avoidable. You probably didn't need to use such a heavy-handed response in Thailand. But the argument that they're making is judge us by our alternative choices, not by an ideal world that doesn't exist. Because both with Churchill and with Abisit, there was no world in which nobody dies. In Churchill's world, the boat gets sunk, or the boat doesn't get sunk and other people die on a different part of the battlefield. In Abisit's world, there's no world in which violence stops. So it's about trying to think about what would it be like to be in a position where you have to make an impossible choice, and it's not a thought experiment for these people.
How can being thrust into power affect our decision-making?
There's another instance of power affecting people's decision-making that I think is highly instructive in how we evaluate people who are thrust into these roles of power, even when they don't want to be. And that is a moment after Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans in 2005. So when this horrific storm struck, it created a cascade of problems in the health system. And one of those problems was at Memorial Hospital, a key hospital in the center of the city where electricity was cut off and all sorts of patients had no ability to access life-saving care. They had a backup generator with a limited amount of power, and they basically began to play God. And they had to play God because they had to decide how to allocate finite resources during a crisis. The clock was ticking, people were dying, they didn't have that much electricity, they didn't have enough medicine for everyone, they needed to decide who was a priority. And that meant that one doctor was put in a position where she had to decide who was a priority and who wasn't. And this creates all sorts of moral dilemmas. Do you try to allocate the resources to the people who are most sick? Or do you allocate the resources to the people who are most likely to be saved? Because the people who are most sick are likely to die, no matter what you do. And then, if you've allocated these scarce resources to people who are on their deathbed anyway, who can't be rescued, then you end up in a situation where you've wasted the resources that might have saved a life that otherwise could not be saved. So in this situation, you have her making decisions about who lives and who dies. But she takes it one step further. She begins to assess who is likely to die and who is suffering. And once she's decided who is suffering, she starts to, it is alleged, administer higher than average, aka toxic doses of certain drugs. And what's really striking when you look at the casualty rate in that hospital is that the floor that she was responsible for in that hospital had a very large number of people who did not have life-threatening illnesses who died in a span of several hours. And the allegations, there's been various criminal and civil prosecutions around this, civil proceedings around this. The allegations are that she injected them deliberately to end their life. Now, this is obviously a moral dilemma. It's a situation where if you knew with certainty that someone was dying and you could do nothing for them and they would absolutely die a horrific death, and you wanted to give them a painkiller that would ease their pain but may end up creating their death, some people take the side of the doctor on that. They start to say, okay, it makes sense. The problem is that this is, of course, a moment where the doctor would never have done this in any normal situation. Right? I think there's an illuminating lesson that we can definitely agree on, whether you think the doctor did the right thing or the wrong thing in this situation. What we can agree on is that the doctor wouldn't have had to make this decision under normal circumstances. So she was thrust into an elevated position of power, effectively playing God, because of a crisis. And that shows you something about power more deeply. It shows you that power itself provides more opportunities for people to inflict harm on each other. If you're someone who doesn't have any authority in your normal, daily life, it's a lot harder to affect the lives of hundreds or thousands of people. If you're the prime minister of a country or you're in charge of a hospital during a crisis, it's a lot easier to inflict harm. So one of the things that tends to happen is that powerful people are sometimes seen to be worse precisely because they're thrust into these moments where they have the power to do worse things, and that makes their actions more consequential. It's important to accurately diagnose what's happening. With this doctor in Memorial Hospital during Hurricane Katrina, what was happening was a person thrust into an immense position of power who made a choice that caused death that would not have been able to do that or would not have ever considered doing it in the normal realm of their life in which they were less powerful. So opportunity and power are closely linked.
How can we evaluate the decisions of individuals in power?
One thing that's really important to understand when you evaluate people in power is what is the true effect of power corrupting and what just looks like power corrupting because power has certain weird effects on people, or the system of power operates in a sort of strange way. And I highlight 4 mitigating factors that make power appear to corrupt when something else is actually going on. Those 4 I call the problem of dirty hands, the idea of learning, the problem of opportunity, and the problem of scrutiny. So when it comes to dirty hands, it's the idea that people who are in positions of power often face awful choices where there's only downsides. It is often said, and people do say to me when they are in positions of power, if you want to survive in this business, if you want to wield power, if you want to have power, you've got to get your hands dirty. And what they mean by that is you have to make impossible choices. You have to harm people sometimes because the alternatives also harm people. So you end up inflicting damage because there's no good option. That makes it look like you have dirty hands, when in fact, some of the time at least, the system is providing you with a series of options that are all bad. Your hands are going to get dirty no matter what, and the people who are out of power are the only ones who can keep their hands clean, because we never have to encounter these situations where you choose who lives and who dies. The second, of learning, is this idea that people learn to get good at being bad. What I mean by that is, if you imagine someone who's already a rotten person, a corrupt person, if you stick them into a position of power, they're going to be a newbie. They're not going to know what they're doing. So they're not going to be able to inflict harm as easily as somebody who's been in the job for 20 years. Dictators, for example, have something called authoritarian learning. They get better at rigging elections. They get better at repressing people and cracking down on dissent or strategically torturing their enemies. And as a result, what ends up happening is if you look at the data of harm that's produced by people in power, it might get worse over time. Not because the person has become worse, but because they've gotten better at being worse. And so you might misdiagnose it. You might say, oh, power corrupted them. Actually, what happened is they just got better at manipulating the system and inflicting harm on other people. The third mitigating factor is this idea of opportunity. And it's the concept that people who are in positions of power just have more chances to harm other people. So it's going to look like they are worse than the rest of us. Because if you are the president or prime minister or general or CEO, you're going to have the ability to have your decisions hurt other people. If you're somebody who has a job that doesn't really involve many other people or doesn't have any subordinates, your ability to inflict harm on in your daily life is much more limited. The fourth mitigating factor is this concept of scrutiny, or what I call in the book, under the microscope. And it's this idea that actually people in power, although I think they don't get enough scrutiny, still get a lot more scrutiny than the rest of us in terms of journalists looking into them and so on. Now, what that means is that you're going to have more instances of bad behavior show up in the data. One way to understand this is to look at this fascinating anecdote from the 1980s with the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, the tax collection agency in the United States. There was one tax collector who was looking through tax returns, and he saw that all these people were naming Fido as a dependent on their tax returns and getting a tax break as a result of this that's supposed to be just for your children. So he said to his boss, look, I think people are claiming their dogs as dependents. I think to fix this, we should just do something really simple. Let's put on the form next year the Social Security number, a line for the Social Security number of each dependent, which is not very easy to fake. You can't make up a fake Social Security number and get away with it. What happened next was amazing. 7 million children disappeared from one tax year to the next. And the reason for that was because all sorts of people were claiming pets as dependents. Once you had this little tiny tweak, it exposed that this was happening. So what does that tell us? What it tells us is that a lot of people were behaving badly underneath the surface. We just couldn't see it. There was no scrutiny. And indeed, when you see lots of abusive power scandals, this is exactly what's happening. Bernie Madoff was bad from the start. Bernie Madoff's investment fund was always crooked. It was always a Ponzi scheme. It was always one thing that was behaving in a way that should have gotten him caught, probably arrested. But only when he started making so much money did people start looking into this. And so it was a question of, is he under the microscope? There have to be hundreds, maybe thousands of Bernie Madoffs out there who are just escaping scrutiny. They're doing this all the time, but we don't know. I'm sure there's plenty of embezzlement. I'm sure there's plenty of fraud happening below the surface. It gets exposed at a greater degree when you have people in power. Now, when you put these 4 together, these 4 mitigating factors, they teach you a lesson, which is that, yes, power corrupts, but try to accurately diagnose what is the corrupting influence of power and what is these aspects of power that are fundamental to how it functions more broadly. And the reason it's important to understand those mitigating factors is because if you chalk up something to power corrupting or a broken system attracting the wrong people or something like that, and in fact what's happening is one of these four phenomena, you're going to come up with the wrong solution, because you're going to misdiagnose what's actually going on. So these four mitigating factors are very much not me saying, let's just let leaders get away with it, right? I'm very clear that we should not simply say, oh, because of these four mitigating factors, we should not hold leaders accountable. We absolutely should. But they're just for us to make smart assessments of what's actually happening around power so we can make better decisions, both in punishing leaders who behave badly and in fixing systems in the first place.
To learn even more from the world's biggest thinkers, get Big Think Plus for your business.